So it's really nice to be here and meet everyone. Like Marianne, I'm meeting people for the first time. I think Jacques and I have been working on Working Group 4 for several years, and today's the first time to meet in person, so it's very exciting. It's very exciting just to leave Scotland after almost 2 years of being grounded. So I think some of you already know me. My name's Kirstin Mitchell, and I'm based at the University of Glasgow. I'm a professor of social science and public health. I lead a programme of research on social relationships and health, and my own interests are particularly on the links between intimate relationships and health. One of the other hats I wear is as a member of the British National Survey of Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles. So this morning I'm really pleased to be talking to you about sexual well-being, and for those of you paying attention during Pedro's talk, you'll have heard the word sexual well-being many times, and we quite often use it interchangeably with sexual health. And so I want to present some work that we're doing across the National Survey of Sexual Attitudes to try and... Can people hear me okay? It seems like there's a bit of an echo. Is that better? No, still. Is that better? Well, that sounds better. No? The same? Or I could step away. Can people hear me if I stand like this and I talk loudly? Okay.
Let me say that I can hear you perfectly online, Kirstin, so...
Okay, so we hear the word sexual well-being a lot, and we often hear it used interchangeably with sexual health. And so we're trying to understand, is it actually the same thing or is it something different? So I quite often share this slide when I talk about sex during COVID times, and sex has sort of a little bit become... this has become our life, really. Everything's gone online. And, you know, it's interesting to think about that in relation to sexual well-being too. So I want to begin by I'm standing here on my own, but really the work I'm going to talk about is a real strong collaboration, and particularly with these four people, Dennis Fortenberry at Indiana University, Ruth Lewis in Glasgow, and Lucia O'Sullivan, who's in Canada, as well as the broader NatSal team. So I want to start by talking about well-being generally. Simply put, it means how we're doing. And this could be as individuals, workplaces, communities, and as a nation. And it's not just about how we're doing right now, but how we are likely to do in future, so whether our current well-being is sustainable. Our well-being is actually already tracked and monitored in many different ways. The Office of National Statistics in the UK, for instance, uses indicators like personal, relationships, health, economy, and environment. So things that affect us as an individual, but also things that affect us as societies. Internationally, the OECD compares countries on well-being across the range of indicators that you can see on the slide. Things like housing, safety, work-life balance. And if you have a spare moment, I would recommend to go onto their site, because it's quite fun to choose what you see as the priorities in terms of these indicators, and the countries move up and down depending on how well they're doing. And it's a key point that one of the aspects of well-being is that it kind of depends on what we see as important and what we prioritize. So Maslow argues that actually these priorities or motivations can be placed on a hierarchy such that the lower level needs, those at the bottom of the pyramid, must be met first before the higher level needs can be met. So things like food, warmth, they must be met first, followed by, then you can go up the level to things like safety and security. So you can see that the need for belonging and love comes just next after that. And that's about belonging, love, and that includes intimate relationships. And yet, despite this, and despite, I think, I'm sure we all agree here, the centrality of sexuality as to the importance of human experience, there are no commonly used measures of general well-being that include a sexual dimension. So I've only just come across this one study by Hugh et al. In Belgium, and they managed to design a brief 5-item measure that included satisfaction with sex life alongside health, leisure, family, and social. So they've actually shown it can be done, but as far as I'm aware, there are none of the big measures of well-being include a sexual dimension. And I think that that is hard to justify, and I'm sure many of you agree. So we heard about the WHO definition of sexual health from Pedro. The concept of sexual health has provided a guiding framework for addressing sexuality in public health for several decades now. And this WHO definition is revolutionary, as Pedro told us, because it acknowledges positive sexuality and provides a positive framing for health-focused research and practice in sexuality. And yet public health approaches remain focused on risk and adverse outcomes. And yet in practice, professional perspectives on what constitutes normal sexuality still come to be understood using a public health lens. So we have a bit of a conceptual muddle going on and a conflation of sexual health and sexual well-being that's been going on for decades in the sexual health academic research. Undoubtedly, there's growing interest in understanding and using the concept, but few studies explicitly define it, and many use the term sexual well-being when actually what they've measured is something like sexual function, pleasure, or satisfaction. So this makes it a bit difficult to advance science, and it's limited our ability to understand and address everyday sexual issues. And as Pedro has already shown us, this is important in tackling sexual and reproductive health challenges and targets such as the Sustainable Development Goals. So in a sense, inside academia and health practice, sexual well-being has come to mean everything and also nothing. But what about outside? What about the real world, if you like? Well, in the UK at least, it's not a term really that people use very much. Except perhaps I just went into our local pharmacy, we call it Boots, and saw it being used here to sell products, and I was very interested in what they were selling under sexual well-being. It included things like female tightening gel, nutritional supplements, aids to conception, and even ingrown pubic hair. So all of these are commodified under the banner of sexual well-being. And so this is really what it becomes then mean, to everyday people who just see it when they go into their local chemist. So the work that we've been trying to locate sexual well-being in relation to sexual health, as well as in relation to two other pillars of public health inquiry, sexual pleasure and sexual justice. Sexual pleasure could be understood as event-related, so tied to a particular occasion or occasions, or person-related, so tied to interactional and interpersonal dynamics. Sexual justice is really important. That's about ensuring social, cultural, and legal supports for equitable, person-centered sexual and reproductive experiences. And it's important, as we've hopefully shown in the diagram here, that there are interdependencies across these four pillars. So, for example, it's very difficult to experience sexual pleasure if your basic sexual rights aren't being met. So what we're doing here is trying to propose sexual well-being not as an extension, subclass, or alternate form of sexual health, but as a distinct concept with far-reaching global applications in public health. So I think it's likely that we will experience some resistance to considering well-being as a valid goal of public health. And the work that Pedro has really presented to us just now is really important in our global efforts to have sexual health and well-being validated by governments. That's really, really impressive, but also within the public health sphere. But I think we have experienced resistance, and we should continue to expect that. So critics of the whole idea of well-being refer to its subjective and variable qualities and the fact that it's necessarily influenced by social and cultural contexts that are played out in individual feelings and actions. So I just want to pause for a minute to try and state clearly why sexual well-being matters for public health. So to those who feel uncomfortable moving away from a focus on risk, and I'm really thinking about public health audiences here, we have to keep stating and restating that the goals related to pleasure shape both risk-taking and risk reduction. So we can't really talk about risk reduction without bringing in pleasure. Population well-being approaches more broadly tend to seek measurable goals towards equity, and sexual well-being could do this too. It can help point to systemic and pervasive discrimination based on gender, race, sexual identity, including trauma that goes through generations. And from there, we can support implementation of population health approaches that are anti-oppressive, intersectional, and culturally adapted. As I tried to argue at the beginning, sexual well-being, it should be an important component of overall well-being. And as such, it could also be a meaningful population indicator in this regard. So data on sexual well-being over the life course could add new dimensions to community engagement in local and larger public health policy and practice related to sexual and reproductive health, including policy initiatives such as the Sustainable Development Goals, as Pedro has already talked about. Related to that, sexual well-being could capture population trends that are distinct from sexual health. For instance, the French national surveys have shown that the proportion of people reporting sexual intercourse as essential to feeling good about oneself rose from 48% to 60% in women, and from 55% to 69% for men between 1970 and 2006. So if we have a clear concept of sexual well-being, we can start to track this and track progress within and across populations. And finally, sexual well-being helps refocus the ethics, form, and practice of public health. And by that I mean it could become a driver for cross-cutting public health innovation, policies that recognise sexual well-being, that recognise that sexual well-being is experienced by people in relation to context and surroundings. So it's not just an individual trait. People's sexual well-being reflects their lived realities and the cultural forces that are upon them. Now, of course, this would require some surveillance of sexual well-being in the way that we currently have surveillance on STIs, and there may be some discomfort with that. So I want to just turn now to what is going on in academia and to try and kind of get a sense of the idea of sexual well-being, to capture it and measure it. So you may have come across the review by Lorimer and colleagues, and they identified 162 studies in which sexual well-being was included as an outcome. And all the selected studies either purported to measure sexual well-being or otherwise employed the term. And the authors took the studies that they reviewed, they took it at face value that if the author of that study used the term sexual well-being, that they were meaning to measure it and not just kind of glossing over that term. But what they found was actually only 10 of the 162 studies provided an explicit definition of sexual well-being. They found very few multi-domain measures, and most were focused on cognitive, affective, and interpersonal domains. Very few of these measures included sociocultural domains or dimensions. Their work included, just notably, a work by Laumann and colleagues who measured sexual well-being using 4 satisfaction judgments, so defining it as the cognitive and emotional evaluation of an individual's sexuality. And again, it's very much focused on the individual here. And Muse defined it as, they kind of focused on 4 aspects of sexual well-being: satisfaction with sexual relationships and functioning, sexual awareness, sexual self-esteem, and body image esteem. So I just wanted to pick those out as 2 of the key contributions that were mentioned in the Lorimer Review. We're seeing quite a kind of almost explosion of interest in sexual well-being, I'd say, in the field, and lots of people are trying to grapple with this. And so even since the Lorimer Review, there's been 3 notable contributions. Syme et al., in their study of sexual wellness in later life, used the domains of psychological, social, biological, and cultural. So that was a really nice, broad conceptual framing of sexual well-being. Sasha Stolhofer, who many of you know, he and his team, again, in relation to older people, they came up with a 5-dimension measure of sexual well-being, and they focused on things like intimacy during sex, distress over sexual function, frequency of cuddling, sexual satisfaction, and perceived sexual compatibility. So you can already get a sense of the quite varied ranges of domains that people are capturing. And then Jerry Minsky, I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce that right, their short sexual well-being scale, they validated that again among transgender and cisgender people, and they included things like sexual frequency, so it's another idea again, sexual distress, physical sexual satisfaction, emotional sexual fulfillment, and social aspects of sexuality. So there's quite a lot going on, and people are defining it in different ways. Just talking about where we've got to so far, more broadly the limitations, so not to pick on any particular measure. We can see this real conflation between sexual health, sexual pleasure, sexual function, and satisfaction. And global satisfaction items in particular are very limited in capturing sexual well-being because they just ignore that whole multidimensional aspect to it. A lot of the work so far has limited applicability to those who are asexual or not having sex or not in established partnerships. The current measures we have, there's currently limited utility for informing policy, public health action, clinical support or personal growth, and that's partly because a few of them have been designed to measure change over time, so that's in terms of things like intervention outcomes. They're not designed to necessarily pick up change, and they tend to be focused on individual psychological states and traits. And they all tend to focus on the present and not the near future, which then limits our understanding of the sort of fluctuations of sexual well-being over time. So I've talked about the challenges, and I've talked about how tough it is. Nevertheless, in our team, we decided to give it a crack and try and understand sexual well-being ourselves. And that's partly because, Pedro's talked about the importance of engaging with policymakers and practitioners. We can't really engage with them if we're still at the level of big ideas. We need to start talking concretely, and we need to start operationalizing some of these ideas. And it's a painful process because some of our big ideas, when they become operationalized, we can always feel disappointed. It's always more difficult than we think it's going to be at the beginning. But I believe that we need to make those compromises in order to come up with measures that interventions can use, that policymakers and practitioners can use in their day-to-day work. So we've taken up the Office of National Statistics idea of how we're doing. How are we doing sexually? And we're building on the work of others that I've presented. So in setting out to operationalize it, we had 4 key criteria. We wanted the idea to be applicable to people regardless of whether they're sexually active, regardless of their relationship status. We wanted to ensure that aspects of sexual well-being were amenable to change. And of course, for the NatSal survey and for any clinical practitioner, any measure needs to be brief. I've talked a little bit about desire, that our grand aims versus the realities. It's very difficult because of this subjectivity in priorities and preferences. That's part of the colour in life, but it makes it very difficult to come up with a measure that feels relevant to everyone. It's also very difficult to come up with a self-report measure that really captures those structural influences that I've talked about as being really important in kind of saying whether or not we have sexual well-being. And then also to have a measure that everyone can complete regardless of their varied experiences and sexual histories. I'm not really going to spend much time on methodology. I can link you to some papers if you're interested in hearing more. But basically, before we began the measure, we wanted to talk to people about their own experiences. We did quite a lot of conceptual work and theoretical work and reviewing the literature. And as a team, we proposed 7 domains. And we took these to people. And this was part of our development work for the next National Survey of Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles. And we wanted to, first of all, hear their ideas. What does sexual well-being mean to you? And then to present some ideas around these 7 domains and ask them, well, you know, what do you think? Does this resonate with you? Is this part of your experience? So it's a kind of validation process. So I'm going to just take you briefly through the 7 domains. For each domain, I'm just going to briefly connect it to public health relevance and then highlight our participants and what they said about it. So the first domain, sexual security and safety, and we define this as the experience of limited threat coupled with actions taken to assuage vulnerability. And it directs relatedly to public health in terms of things like addressing safety for sex workers. So one of our participants said, you know, when you're doing things and you're meeting people, it can be quite scary. You don't know what's going to happen, and you have to sort of take safety into account. And I think it's notable that that was a man saying that, not a woman. Sexual comfort, we define this as experience of ease and contemplation, communication, and enactments of sexuality and sex. I think I'm very much talking to the converted here when I say that communication is so important, you know, for public health. If you can't talk about sex, how can you talk about, you know, using contraception and using condoms? And, you know, that's just the start. What about ensuring that you have pleasurable experiences, you know, if you can't talk about it? So a participant here said, you know, if you don't feel comfortable, then you're going to be in panic mode when it's happening, and you won't really be concentrating on being relaxed and enjoying it. And I'll show you later that came into our measure, this idea of being in the moment and being able to experience flow. Then we move on to sexual self-determination. So this is the choice or rejection of sexual partners' behaviours, context and timing without pressure, force or felt obligation. So the idea that individuals should have agency over their sex lives and be free to say yes or no without pressure or force. And again, I'm sure we can all think of lots of public health examples where this is key, including reproductive sexual determination for self-determination for women, so their right to an abortion as a very obvious example of that. So a couple of quotes from participants. One says, when I was younger, I had a lot of pressure from friends. There was a lot of pressure, and I could have said no, but it was awkward, and you know, I ended up kind of going along with it. The second one says, the sense of control and ability to choose who I have sex with, that was very important to me. I don't want to have sex with anyone. I want to know who they are and to have a common ground with them. So respect. This is the perception of positive regard by others for one's sexual personhood. And we can relate this to public health in terms of policies to promote sexual minority and groups living with HIV, promote their rights and to ensure that societies are respectful of those who don't fit into that heterosexist assumptions. We've got a couple of participants here. One said, I guess sexual respect means that my husband and I are on the same page. I know he's gone to Magaluf and he's paid for a private dance, and it really upset me. So that's an example of respect within a relationship. My family aren't really accepting of it. That's my bisexuality, to be honest with you, which is difficult. So yeah, personally, I feel it's very important. Sexual self-esteem, which is the effective appraisal of oneself as a sexual being. And we can see this very clearly in interventions to improve sexual functioning. One participant said, I was in a relationship where I wasn't being pleased and I didn't do what I wanted to do, and I actually lost touch with what I wanted. And another one said, you know, feeling sexually attractive to others, I think that's really important because, you know, it's really impacted me since I've had the illness, because I've had physical changes to my body, to my face, and it makes me, you know, I used to be quite a confident person about my looks, and now I'm not so much anymore. So really bringing out that kind of intersection between what can go on for people health-wise and their sexuality and their sexual self-esteem. Resilience, that's about maintaining equilibrium in response to sexual distress, dysfunctions, adversity or trauma. And again, this is particularly key in terms of lessening sexual minority stresses and recovery from emotional trauma. And one person here says, you know, I think being assaulted by an older man, it put me off for a while, but I knew that all other people are not like this person. Obviously, I knew that that was wrong, but I knew other people weren't like that. So just talking about that resilience of being able to say, I had that really awful experience, but I've been able to come to terms with it and still be able to form positive judgments about other people. And related to that really important is the idea of sexual forgiveness. We mean that in the kind of psychological sense rather than the everyday sense of the word. So letting go, closure. And this is about interrupting patterns of self-blame, self-stigmatization, shame, avoidance, aggression and revenge. And the participant said, you know, you've got to be able to let go of those negative thoughts, because if you can't, how can you fully engage in the relationship that you're in or the moment that you're in? So those are our domains. I'm going to skip right over how we designed the measure, because I'm sure you'd rather much get to lunch a little bit earlier. But I'm very happy to take questions over lunch. Basically, we did two web-based surveys, and anyone who's done measure validation will be familiar with this. You put in your measure, you then do exploratory factor analysis, confirmatory factor analysis. You look at other measures that you think should be related to it, and confirm that as part of your external validation. You have to make sure that it all hangs together, what you're measuring hangs together as a single construct. So I just wanted to show you the items that we've come up with. Together, each one of those domains is represented in them. It's a 13-item to measure. We were really pleased with ourselves to get it down to 13 items, but I can tell you, I still had to fight for this to be included in the 4th national survey. The competition for space in the survey is so intense, and people were not happy with this number of items. So it was still a struggle, even though we felt like reducing it to 13 felt, you know, not quite adequate to reflect everything that we've done. But I believe that these items, as well as being important as a measure, will really help us get more depth in the other things that we've we're measuring in the survey, like contraception, STIs, sexual violence. These are just the results of the psychometric analysis, just to reassure you that it has good model fit, test-retest reliability, and has measurement and variance across gender, age, relationship status, and sexual orientation. And it was also associated with all the things that we thought it should be, like self-esteem, well-being, body image, sexual functioning, negatively associated with depression and anxiety, distress, and sexual depression in particular. So, just to sum up, what I've said is that measures of general well-being rarely include sexual dimensions. And I hope, and I for the remaining years of my career, I hope to work towards seeing change in that and having broad measures of well-being that include sexuality. I talked about the conceptual muddle that we currently have, the conflation of sexual well-being and sexual health, but also sexual function and pleasure. And to try and help us sort through that muddle, we've proposed 4 pillars for public health inquiry: sexual health, sexual well-being, sexual justice, and sexual pleasure. And we've shown how these are overlapping, but also distinct. We've defined sexual well-being as how we're doing sexually, and we're proposing 7 domains: forgiveness, resilience, self-esteem, respect, self-determination, and comfort. And I think you'll see how we've made some of the compromises. It's probably not enough reflective of the sociocultural influences, but I personally think we might need other measures for that, and we need to work at population level with governments to include national level indicators. And we're arguing that sexual well-being is key to public health. It can be a marker of health equity. It's a meaningful population indicator of well-being. It can capture trends distinct from sexual health, and it can help us refocus the ethics, form, and practice of public health. So thank you for listening. Thank you to all my colleagues on the NatSal team, and obviously thank you to our participants who contributed to the study.